So this is also a little bit of an intro for Michael to a bit of the changes that we have. So welcome everybody again to our scientific conference, still virtual, but it will be very interesting to listen to Michael also how maybe the future will look like or what we should really consider when we think about measures and how we treat the pandemic. About BII, we have always been about our people and about excellent science, and we've gotten a new extra thrust by being also a data hub. This allows us to be a central trusted place for the data at analysis, and of course this is only possible with the people being able to do the analysis and developing them also. In addition, we are always asked to align with the national priorities, and in the RE 2025, there are some key areas where BII has been traditionally good. This includes epidemic preparedness, digital health, and human potential. And of course, we are asked to come up with some kind of winning strategy. And that's not very different from what we have done. We always try to add value to data. And we do this by being a data hub, doing good analysis, and of course, the right people. In terms of structure, you can see that we are still very stable with our divisions. We have, based on a data type, sequence-based, structure, and image. But we also have horizontals that cross over with digital health, human potential, epidemic preparedness, and all of this in a data lake with a new biometar added to BII. We are also embedded in the ecosystem where we have joint appointees with 9 of the other institutes. And through this, we form a bioinformatics network that we have a broad range of capacities that cover all of the areas of bioinformatics. And just a little pat on the back for all of you, we have done pretty well already with these changes. And we've grown 36% in the last year. We've increased our industry revenue by a lot. We have to continue doing that amount. And I think it's a challenge, but it's interesting. And our teams are really, really well prepared to do so. We also continue to publish well. We want to try to focus on publish more quality papers, as well as interact with the public sector in Singapore, so that we are really a good partner for the ecosystem. And that's already the last slide. And I think this shows pretty much the last time we all came together, 2019, whereas the next 2 years essentially followed us being remotely, just like still today. And this is a good segue to show and introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Michael Levitt. Let me stop sharing the screen. So Michael was born in South Africa, and he carried out his undergrad in physics at King's College in London, I think, and a PhD in biophysics at the MRC labs in Cambridge. Then a postdoc was an EMBO award at Weizmann with Shneur Lifson, together with Arya Warshel. There he started the field of multiscale modeling, for which he got, together with Arya and Martin Kaplas, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry 2013. Then back to Cambridge, 3 years working with Francis Crick, 7 more years at Weizmann, then moved to Stanford 1987. Member of National Academy of Sciences, EMBO, government advisor, academia, pharma. Chandra told the first paper was a single-author Nature paper on the molecular model of tRNA in 1969. That's interesting. Also, some seminal other work, for example, a JMB paper in 1969 with Lifson about the energy minimization on biomolecules. Your connection to BII, of course, also you're very dear to us. You were part of the first SAP of BII for 6 years. You've always been a wonderful mentor, a guide and friend of the Institute. We know you love hiking and you like to solve hard problems. And one of the most distinguished features is you like to help young scientists gain the independence that also your generation has enjoyed. So with this, and looking forward to a very interesting talk, welcome and thank you, Michael Levitt.
Thank you very, very much, Sebastian. I'm going to share my screen and fine. No, I just want to. Okay, so I think you can see my mouse as well. And this talk is basically in an area that I actually knew nothing about 2.5 years ago. And nowadays, I think I know too much about. So basically, I've been working on COVID now for almost 800 days. And in many ways, I'm not ill with COVID-19. I'm obsessed with COVID-19. The talk is actually going to cover quite a few different areas, and I'm not sure we're going to get to them all. Let's just leave them and just see how it goes. So basically, as I said, I've been involved from the very start. I got involved accidentally. I wrote my first report on COVID on the 2nd of February, 2020. That is, I think, on day 10, that data was available. And what I did in this report, which has 2 pages, is I sent this report to many friends, both in China and in the West, by email or WeChat. And the report actually had 2 pages. One is actually giving the data. There was so little data back then that you could list all the data. And in my case, it's the number of cases and deaths in 2 places, in China, and in China, Hubei. So that is the data. And then the second page basically just gave some analysis of the data. Now, what happened is, I am inexperienced at analyzing epidemics, but I'm quite experienced at analyzing time series. And the data was very noisy, as you'd expect, just 10 days worth of data in the whole world. But one thing I thought that was interesting to look at was the ratio of, say, the number of deaths today divided by the number of deaths yesterday, or the number of cases today divided by the number of cases yesterday. And the reason is that if growth is exponential, that ratio should be fixed. So let's imagine you're growing at 10% today, then today divided by yesterday should be 1.1. And this here shows this ratio both for cases, basically actually shows it for deaths, both inside Hubei or everywhere else in China. And in both cases here, this number is decreasing monotonically from a value of 2.1, which means that on the second day was twice the first day, but very quickly is decreasing. And over here, it looks like it's decreasing along a straight line. So I drew a straight line and wrote to my friends that things looked hopeful. Now, what I didn't realize is that, in fact, what I had written was immediately translated by somebody, one of my WeChat friends, I don't know who, and actually posted on Weixin, translated. And they did a good translation. They translated the headings and so on, but it's exactly what I said. So at this point, I suddenly realized that I've said something quite daring. I've said this is going to end soon. I better study it and not just give up and not do anything. So basically, over the next 24 days or 26 days between the 2nd of February and the 28th of February 2020, the amount of data increased, as you'd expect. And this initial straight line seemed to be becoming a less steep straight line, but again, converging. And this basically all led to the realization that the pandemic, which was principally in Hubei, in Wuhan, would be ending early in March. And this is, in fact, what happened. Now, it turns out that there were many, many simplistic things in what I did here. So with the new outbreaks, we became more involved and looked at other different countries. And what we realize are that there are different kinds of growth functions. A growth function is something that starts low, goes up, and ends up at a plateau. It could be an enzyme reaction. It could be almost anything they solve, but they're generalized growth functions. And in fact, there are very many different kinds of growth functions. In this review from 2013, there's like a flow chart of growth functions. And the 2 that we focused on were the 2 simplest: the classical logistic function, which is a sigmoid function that's used in neural networks and everything else, and another function called the Gompertz function. The Gompertz function is actually named after Gompertz, who thought about this function and published it in 1825, almost 200 years ago. And the logistics function was actually published later in about 1850. So let's just think a little bit about how growth functions can differ, because in fact, they can differ a lot. So here is actually 3 growth functions. This is the logistic function. starts low, goes up and is symmetrical. And the number of new cases is just the derivative of the black line, is a symmetrical peak. If you look at the Gompertz for the same thing, it also seems to be going up, but it's going up asymmetrically. It gets to the top with fewer cases than later. Then we have what we call the capped exponential, which is when a person believes that the growth is purely exponential. And if the growth is purely exponential, then it should go up like this, linearly on a log plot. And then at some point you say stop. Maybe you run out of people, maybe everyone is locked down. So essentially you get exponential growth and then you stop it. And the capped exponential growth actually looks quite a lot like the logistics function, but very different from the Gompertz function. And an important thing with growth functions is the slope on the log scale. That's just the exponential growth factor. It's flat for exponential growth here, and then you stop it and it goes down to 0. Same thing is true for logistic function. It's flat, it stops and goes down to 0. The Gompertz function is very different. The exponential growth factor starts really, really high. If this is 1.1, this is something like 7 or 8 times higher. 1.1, 2.2 on a log scale, 0.14 to 0.8, which is 5 times higher on a linear scale. The exponential growth factor starts very, very high and drops. If we just take these same quantities and put them onto a log scale, we see that this is flat and drops, this is flat and goes down a straight line, and this is going down a straight line from the very beginning. So that is actually a very important difference, and we'll see why. And most people have assumed that epidemics grow exponentially, and this is exponential growth. This is not exponential growth. A straight line on this plot is exponential growth. This is not. Okay, so just to summarize that, we looked at the fractional change that I mentioned before, the value of cases or death today divided by the value yesterday. And this thing, we take the log of this to get the exponential growth rate. So the quantity we're looking at is the log of the ratio of today to yesterday. In my early plots in China, I plotted this number directly instead of plotting its log. And that's why it starts steep and gets more and more shallow. Okay. So just to look at the difference again, here we're looking at a logistics function and a Gompertz function with exactly the same parameters. And basically the Gompertz function they both have the peak at the same time, but the exponential growth or the logistics function started a long time before to get to here. In other words, exponential growth is doubling every day, but if you want to go from 1 to 128, that's still 8 doublings. It takes time. So the Gompertz function is basically going much more quickly. But the log of the exponential growth rate, shown here in blue, is flat and then goes down. But for the Gompertz function, it's not defined before case number 1. It goes down in a straight line. Okay. So basically, this is some of the theory. Now let's look. We jumped to about middle of March 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, and start looking at what's going on. So basically, here are some outbreaks, and we're plotting on this exactly the same numbers that we plot here. The total counts on a log scale, the exponential growth rate on a log scale, and the daily counts on a linear scale on this side. So when we plot that, what we see for real outbreaks is this. So here is China, non-Hubei, goes up and goes down. This is curved, but this is going down on a straight line. It's never flat. Same thing is true in New Zealand. Going up, going down. This had an outbreak of only 1,000 cases. This was an outbreak of 10,000 cases. In Lombardy, there were actually 100,000 cases, and in New York. But in every case, we see a peak, which is asymmetric. The peak goes down more slowly than it goes up. And this exponential growth rate is going down along a straight line. Of course, there's noise. You can see the cases have a huge level of noise, but we can have to deal with it. Now let's just look everywhere. So these are 35 outbreaks that happened from the 15th of January 2020 up until the 30th of June, in the first 6 months of 2020. And these outbreaks, here's China. What we see here is they actually released deaths that they had forgotten or didn't release. Other places also, this is New York City, they also released deaths. But what you will see just by glancing is that in every case, the peak is asymmetric and its exponential growth factor is decreasing linearly on a log scale. This not always, this is an exception. In Japan, Europe, Sweden, Netherlands, Germany, Korea is a bit of an exception. France is very noisy. And then we find cases where it goes down, like in Iran here, and starts to go up. This is because everything I've told you about is for a single outbreak. And in reality, there is more than a single outbreak. So that's important to realize. And then sometimes things are very, very slow. So essentially we see that this behavior of this thing going down in a straight line is basically seen in every single isolated outbreak in the world. And here are these cases, and here you can see these cases. It's probably worth asking, can this be fitted better by a Gompertz function or logistics function? And just for R, you'll see in these cases like Lombardy in New York, this is a straight line. It doesn't look at all. The logistics is flat and there is a straight line. It doesn't fit so well. Also, you can see here, this fits very beautifully over here. The logistics function is rising too quickly, too early, and doesn't fit. And we see the same thing. Now, some places don't fit. South Korea doesn't fit. Japan didn't fit. South Africa didn't fit. And the problem is, I've been saying all along, this is the fit for a single outbreak. You don't necessarily have to have a single outbreak. You could have 2 outbreaks in different sides of the city. You could have 2 outbreaks in different sides of the country. All the counts are pooled, usually for, say, South Korea or Japan or even New York State. You don't always get counts at the level of a very small area. So multiple outbreaks are a problem because basically a single outbreak seems to have a well-defined trajectory. But if you have lots and lots of multiple outbreaks, you're in trouble. And I see the problem is a little bit like a forest fire. If a forest fire is burning, it is actually increasing much less slowly than exponential. It's basically moving across the area is increasing at a fixed rate because the number of new trees are proportional to the perimeter of the circle of the forest fire. But if you have a forest fire and you have a really nasty helicopter pilot who flies in, grabs a burning tree and drops it into 2 new forests, everything will start to grow exponentially. Each forest will be burning in a non-exponential way, but overall, because of this mixing, we will get overall exponential growth. So this is important to realize. So you always get multiple outbreaks. This is now looking at the whole period. This is Lombardy. We were looking before at this one peak with a nice, clean exponential growth factor, but in fact, there are other peaks. Iran had many peaks, almost everywhere. And this data, I think, is not even until the end of the year. I think this data was until October. And there are peaks everywhere. India had a peak rather late and nothing in the first. Indonesia had a peak very late. If we came and included here countries in the East Asia, many of them are only having their bad outbreaks now. Each multiple outbreak is a problem because it means that we have nowhere to predict where the next outbreak will be, and we don't really understand how to control multiple outbreaks. So let's just look at some of these multiple cases. We discovered that they can be very well fitted, not by a single Gompertz function, but by multiple Gompertz functions. In this case, we have 3 Gompertz functions, and the fit is absolutely perfect, both to the exponential growth rate and to the actual values. What you see is this going down here says Gompertz, but when you have 2 Gompertz mixed, the line can become flat. It can even ascend due to the mixing of the Gompertz functions. So this mixing can be very, very confusing. It can make things look like the growth is exponential. Level value here means exponential growth. And this looks as if South Africa is growing exponentially, but it's really the overlap of these three functions that add up to give something looking like this. Okay, so given that we think we understand the trajectory of a single outbreak, that it's Gompertz and not exponential or logistic, but the trouble is that if there are susceptible people, we can get new outbreaks in different places in the world and in different places in the same country. So it would be very useful early on to have an estimate of how bad will this disease get if it's out of control. And on the 22nd of March, I actually posted, actually this is wrong, this is 2020, not 2021. Mistake, bad mistake. 2 years ago, I posted something where I looked at the cruise ship Diamond Princess, and from that concluded how bad I thought the burden of death would be if COVID spread relatively unstopped. And what I said in my final paragraph, and again, this is wrong, it should be 2020. This is a very embarrassing mistake because it really was at that date. I can probably prove it, actually, well, it doesn't say, but it's true. Anyway, so I said, thus the Western world has been encouraged by their lack of responsibility, coupled with uncontrolled media and academic errors, to commit suicide for an excess burden of death of 1 month. Surely we or someone we know can do something about this. At the time, the estimates that were coming out of Imperial College were that the burden of death would be 1 year of extra death. And I felt that it was really 1 month of extra death. Now, what made me think this? Well, in February, besides February 2020, besides the fact that the outbreak in China was steadily reaching a peak and coming to an end, a cruise ship was stuck off Yokohama in Japan with about 3,700 passengers on it, and they caught COVID. And what was good about the cruise ship, or maybe bad about the cruise ship, is they now introduced PCR testing. So the cases were actually measured by doing PCR testing. And when you actually look at the cases, these are the same plots I showed before, red being in deaths, red being cases and black being deaths. They start low, they go up. There's a peak in both cases, and the exponential growth rate is sort of decreasing linearly. These are very, very small numbers. The total number of cases per day never got to more than 60. The total number of deaths in a day never got to more than 1. But this data was interesting because about 20% of the population of the ship tested positive. People were isolated, but a cruise ship does not have separate air conditioning for every cabin. And the density on a cruise ship is really, really high. If you do a rough calculation based on the area of the ship, the density of a cruise ship is about 25 times higher than the density of Hong Kong, which is pretty high. So, that's important. Okay, so basically, if you looked at these data, and in August 2020, I tweeted about them, but also later, you can do very simple proportionality analysis. We have this location, it's not a country, but it's a location called the Diamond Princess, with about 1,700 people on it over the age of 65. By this time, we knew that COVID was much, much more dangerous to people over 65. We knew this because of very pioneering papers that were published by medical teams in Wuhan. So let's imagine we take a country with 1,700 people and they have 7 deaths. This corresponds to about 400 deaths per million. If you divide, I guess this by this, and get a million, you get about 400 deaths per million, which is about 0.25 chance of death. Okay. This number divided by that is 0.25. Now we look at the United Kingdom. It has about 12 million people over the age of 65. And we just multiply this by that factor, and we get about 52,000 deaths. Again, with a very similar death per million as you'd expect. United States, we would expect 220,000 deaths. Now, in the United Kingdom, there were about 500,000 deaths a year, naturally. In the United States, there were about 3 million natural deaths. So both of these numbers are about 10% of that death, hence my saying 1 month. In other words, 1 month is 1/12 of a year. It's close to 10% of a year. So instead of the death burden from corona being a year of death, which would be about 500,000 people, 10 times this in England, and 2.1 million deaths in the United States, it would only be smaller than that in the first year. Okay, so now let's look at how much death there is in the world. This is important because when a person dies and is diagnosed of dying from corona, very often they have other causes. And in normal times, we don't do PCR tests. So people who go into a hospital, you wouldn't know that they had flu. They would have a heart attack, and then we would be declared as dying from a heart attack. In the times of corona, in different countries, if a person died of whatever cause soever, but had corona, had passed a positive PCR test, their death would be defined as a COVID death. For example, in the United Kingdom, within 28 days of testing positive, you were a COVID death. In other countries, there was actually even medical incentives for dying of corona rather than from other reasons. So the only way we can tell how much death there really was in the last 2 years is by looking at how the death was more than the death we expected. So basically, in different countries, people measure how much death there is. And this is just showing, for example, in the United States, how many death there is for different age groups, over 85, 75 to 85, 65 to 75, and so on. And what you see very quickly is that although there's relatively few people in these high age groups, most of the deaths are in those age groups. This is people in yellow under 65. And you can see, depending on the country, but they all have this pattern because there are always more deaths in winter than there are in summer, basically because of flu. It'll actually be interesting, and I haven't checked this, to see whether in a place like Singapore, there are also more deaths in the winter and the summer. You wouldn't actually expect that because it's on the equator. But certainly all the countries for which there's data, and we only have data for about 35 different countries. Most countries don't keep this data, which is a great pity because it's very, very important data to know how old people are and how many people of each age group die every year. Now, there are national bodies that analyze this death. One is called Euromama, and they looked at different years, and basically in the winter, there is sometimes a big extra peak. These were from flu, and this was from corona. So corona is higher, but the area under these peaks is about maybe a third the size of corona. It depends exactly how much you take the peak and when you take it, and is the current COVID 2 seasons or 1 season and so on. In the United States, they also keep this data, and there they find that COVID, at least until this slide was made in September last year, COVID is about 4 times flu. In other words, the area under here is a quarter of the area over here. It depends where the baseline is and so on, but there's a big disparity. So we felt that it was important to be able to calculate excess death ourselves by a very simple method. And we adopted a very simple method. Let me just first talk about it. I'll go back to the slide here. This is an age band, and we know how many people are in the 85 plus age band in the United States. We know how many die, so we can calculate the death rate for those people. We also know how many people there are in the 75 to 85 band, or the 65 to 75 band, and so on. So for each age band, we can calculate how many deaths we expected, and we can do this for, say, 2017, 2018, and 2019, and get the average death rate. Now we come to apply it to 2020, and we take the actual population in 2020 and apply to it the death rate. Now, what happens is, quite a lot, populations change. In most countries, the number of people over 65 is increasing quite rapidly. And because the death rate in that age group is higher, you actually expect more deaths as you go up. All of these curves you can see are sloping up because there are more people in that band. There are actually fewer people under 65. So the death patterns indicate a death rate caused by disease, but also numbers of deaths that depend on population. So what we do is we take each death band, we have these different age bands, and for each age band, we calculate how many deaths there are in the reference years. From that, we get the death rate in those years and apply those to the population in other years. It's a very simple calculation. Do it easily. Sorry. And these are just the excess death rates of all the countries for which there's data. There's only data for 35 countries. And they basically look, just in these curves, which I'll show you in more detail later, the pink is for people over 65, and the light green is for people under 65. Generally, people under 65 have much lower death rates, deaths per million, and also are less affected by COVID. We can also actually calculate the overall excess death and express this as a fraction of normal death. This is important because if we take two countries, one country has very few old people, and another country has lots of old people, then the country with old people is expected to have more excess death. So we would like to just ask, how much more is the excess death than natural death? When we do this, we find that some countries are quite high. They have 23% higher. Other countries like Taiwan or New Zealand are actually 6% lower. In other words, in New Zealand, over these last 2 years, the amount of death was 6% less than normal. Iceland was 3% less. Sweden was about 1% less. Other countries are about 7 or 8% more. Here you see the bad countries are Bulgaria, Poland, Slovakia, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Croatia, and USA. USA over here is behaving like an East European country or a South American country. So here we have, these are all East European: Hungary, Latvia, Croatia, Lithuania, Czechia, Slovakia, Poland, and Bulgaria. Even here we have Estonia. So it's interesting. USA is about 13% above average. Mean for all these countries is 7.9. If you had an extra month, you would be up by 8.7%, 1/12. 7.9% is a little bit less than an extra month. If you just think back to what we concluded from the Diamond Princess, we expected an extra month per year, and this is exactly what we're seeing. Europe and Eastern Europe is more like 7 weeks, and these 9 locations have a death deficit. The reason they have a death deficit is that for reasons that are still unclear, flu deaths and deaths from colds disappeared completely. It could well be, there are 2 theories. One is that masks completely worked against flu and normal colds. I find that hard to believe because in many East Asian countries, masks are used during flu epidemics. The other reason is that the same people who get corona are also susceptible to flu and to colds. And if they get corona, then they don't get flu, perhaps because their immune system becomes activated and flu can't get in. In any case, people would not record them as dying of flu because the COVID virus has a very strong PCR signal. As I said, in general, we can't really see it here. I'll show it in a second. In general here, the numbers for people under 65, these numbers here are lower or the same as numbers over 65. Poland is 9% and 19%. But for 4 countries, it's actually greater. USA, 10% over 65, 24% under. Chile, 10% under, 20% over. United Kingdom, 6% under, 13% over. This is saying that the excess death in people under 65 is 13% of normal excess death under 65, whereas the excess death of people over 65 is only 6% higher. And these are quite interesting. You can see here that this line is lifted off the baseline. Here, this is showing the excess death. This is the baseline to expect. It's very clear here with the United States. The baseline has increased by about 20%. This is saying that since the very beginning of the outbreak, week 13, which is the beginning of April 2020, there was a lot of extra death for young people. The older people, over 65, were having death in these peaks, the first wave, second wave, third wave, fourth wave, and fifth wave. So that's interesting. Same thing is true in the United Kingdom. We only really see 2 big waves and much less. Canada didn't have very big waves, but also had an elevation of these young people. And Chile, again, the only South American country in our database, has, similar to the United States, the baseline went up and stayed up. Let's look at Europe in more detail. This is all of Europe. We just added together the values to give a population of about 430 million people. It includes Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And you can see there really are only 3 major waves. In between, we had normal times, and young people, there were not very many young people who died in addition to what you'd expect normally. The numbers for under 65, there were 100,000 altogether. So the integral of this and this and this was 100,000. For old people, it was more than 6 times higher. These just show some neighboring countries. For example, well, interesting is Spain and Portugal. Spain had a very big wave in the spring of 2020, and then very little. I mean, a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here. Portugal had very little at the beginning, and then a huge wave. And these are 2 countries which are next to each other, and for some reason, it spread in Spain and didn't spread in Portugal. Here is Denmark and Sweden. Sweden had a big wave at the beginning, a smaller wave in the next winter, but then it actually had a big saving. Here, the thick line is below the baseline. Here, the thick line is below the baseline. This basically means that in Sweden, there's a saving of death. So overall, Sweden ended up coming out negative. So did Denmark. Italy was, again, fairly average. And France was actually negative for young people, i.e. fewer young people died in France than normal, but a lot more older people died. What about the United States? So we can do the same thing for all the states in the United States. Every single one, except Hawaii, is above extra death. The extra deaths go from 30% in New York City to down to 1 or 2%. So United States, again, had the spread of death in different states. Looking at it in more detail, we see exactly what we saw before. I've already shown you this, but there's this very large elevation of the baseline. So basically, since the beginning of April 2020, before even people were thinking very much of COVID, young people started to die in higher numbers. And again, for me, younger is younger than 65. The old people were dying in waves. And you can see here that in Europe, the young people were about 1/7 of the old people. And here, they're about 30%, 35%, maybe even 40%. Okay, just to compare the two, and I'm not going to do this anymore, but you can see a very different behavior. Different places in New York. New York City was really bad, but then not very much. New York State, again, very bad at the beginning, not very much. California didn't have anything in the beginning. It was a bit like Portugal, then got its wave, and Florida had 4 waves, as did Texas. So you get this different pattern, which is actually very, very interesting. It's as if each area has some special property that gives it a different pattern. Just to show you, New York City was the worst hit place in the world. With a population of about 7 million, the excess death, this is the excess death shown here in pink for older people, was 6,000 in the worst week, which was 7 times higher, the 700 in a normal week. What was interesting is after this very big wave, there were very little excess death, suggesting that something had been burnt out. There was saturation. There was an elimination. Similar thing is true in Spain, a very big peak, 2.5 times the baseline, not 7 times the baseline, and then small peak here, and so on. Okay, now we come to East Asia. So East Asia is very interesting because all the countries for which we have data, which are Taiwan, Korea, New Zealand, and Australia, all had significant amounts of negative death. The thick curve is below the dashed curve. The thick curve is below the dashed curve, and so on. And this means that about 5%, these numbers are about 5 or 6% for the older people, over 6%. 6% of the older people who would have been expected to die didn't die. Now let's just apply that, say, to China. So if in each year 6% didn't die, that means that there would be an extra 500,000 people a year, people who would have died, who are frail, who would have died from colds or from flu. So in some senses, the lack of COVID and the lack of flu and other respiratory illnesses has led to a death deficit, an excess of people who would have been expected to die. And this is something which we don't really know about for China because there isn't the data, but Taiwan or Australia or New Zealand or Korea could all be good proxies for China. Okay, now let's try to understand how on earth, why are we getting Gompertz functions? Why not logistics? Why don't we get exponential growth? So it turns out that people love to talk about exponential growth. And the one place where we really encounter exponential growth is in a lab. If we're trying to grow bacteria, we want them to grow exponentially. Now, how do we do that? We don't put down agar dishes and put the bacteria on that, because on an agar dish, the numbers of bacteria will grow like a forest fire. They will just increase as a circle at a fixed rate. That is much, much slower than exponential. To get exponential, we take the bacteria, put them into a big flask, a big fermenter, put lots and lots of food, remove the waste products, and stir like crazy. So as soon as the bacteria have 2 offspring, they immediately find themselves in a new part of the area. Human beings do exactly the opposite. If I get infected, then I will try to infect my children, my wife, all of whom live with me. And that makes it very, very difficult to grow exponentially because we all have similar contexts. So how on earth do bacteria, or how on earth do viruses spread exponentially, even faster than exponentially, through the Gompertz growth? And the answer is very interesting. It comes from having a network that is scale-free. Now, imagine you have a network, a mesh. Say you have a hexagonal mesh, that every person has 6 neighbors. You could take a hexagonal mesh and remove some links and add some links and give people, say, an average of 6, but some up to 10. But a scale-free network is very different from that. It's a network where many people have a few contacts, but quite a lot of people have very many contacts. In fact, the probability of having a certain number of contacts, that goes down as a power law or as a straight line on a log scale. This is known as the scale-free network. It means that some nodes have a few links, but other nodes have many links. If we take a network like this, start here and move to adjacent nodes probabilistically, essentially do a random walk on the network, infecting a node with some probability, recovering with some probability, you get an infection which grows like this and is absolutely perfectly Gompertz. In fact, the dotted lines are what we saw in Italy, as we see here. So basically growing on a network like this absolutely naturally gives us the kind of growth we see everywhere. And this is interesting because it really means that some people have many contacts and other people have very few contacts. Not surprising. It's a bit like some people have many Facebook friends and the average is very, very small. So we get these hubs, these super spreaders. It turns out that this function has a certain time constant, how quickly it goes up. And the time constant depends on the microscopic parameters. It depends on the probability of infecting an individual you're connected to. So for example, this one may infect this one or may not, depending on the probability. It also depends on the probability that this particularly infected locus, will become recovered. And it also depends on average of how many neighbors you connect to. And all of these things give rise to different rates of spread. The rate of spread increases if you have a much higher infectivity and a much lower recovery rate, not surprising. A very interesting thing is if we look at the different size nodes, because in a scale-free network, some nodes are big and some nodes are small, and ask which nodes get infected first. And this is the development of the epidemic. It goes up over here. This is the number of cases. It looks like a Gompertz function. And the exponential growth rate goes down in a straight line, just like we saw for real functions. These are just 3 different cases. This line here is showing the biggest nodes get infected first. The biggest nodes get infected right at the beginning over here. If, on the other hand, you make a network, like I described at first, a hexagonal network where you break some links and add extra links, letting every person infect anyone else, then you get exponential, you get logistics growth. It's exponential at the beginning, and then this is exactly perfect logistics growth. The peak is symmetrical and so on. So the network defines the kind of growth function, the network topology, and the network parameters define how quickly the function spreads. For example, if the rate of recovery is very high and the rate of infection is very low, the outbreak doesn't spread. It's like a forest fire when all the trees are very, very wet. Okay, so is it actually possible to predict trajectories of single outbreaks? Not predict when there will be a new outbreak. That I think is very difficult to predict, because it's a chance event of one infected person getting to the right place. What can we do? Before I do that, let me just say something about these people, these nodes that have many nodes. These nodes with many nodes are likely to be infected first, because somebody who knows lots of people, if any one of their friends gets infected, they will get infected. Then that person will infect all the others. So these super spreaders are the people who initially take a few outbreak cases and spread them. The super spreaders might be events, they might be a meeting, or if they could be a person, let's imagine a train driver, or train conductor, who is asymptomatic, doesn't realize he's sick, and checks everybody's ticket. Or often in China, there is somebody at the door of the supermarket taking your temperature. If that person had COVID, he would be a super spreader. Okay. So it turns out that there's another huge difference between the logistics function and the Gompertz function. If you have logistics functions for different sizes, the functions all start at the same time, but one is going to end at 100,000, the next at 10,000, and the next at 1,000. Well, it turns out at the beginning, they look exactly the same. These are the 3 functions, and increasing up to almost 1,000, they look the same. Although this one is stopping at 1,000, it's essentially the same until maybe 100. This one's stopping at 10,000, it is 2 the same. The Gompertz function is very different. The function for stopping at 1,000 looks very different from the function stopping at 10,000 or the function stopping at 100,000. This means that there's information in the function at the beginning that tells you when it's going to stop. And essentially, you can take these functions, and there are 2 methods that can be used. We call this the ZT method and the JT method. You can extract from the Gompertz function 2 straight lines. This is the straight line of the exponential growth rate on a log scale. If you knew the straight line over here, and your data was very exact, you could just predict the line to go on. The trouble is the data is noisy, and fitting straight lines is problematic. Okay. So here's an example, an animation actually made for me by a Twitter colleague, Ben Martin, of trying to fit the outbreak in New York. I'm going to stop this. So you see here, no good, no good. The prediction is too low. Jumps up. The prediction on the 12th of March has jumped very high. 13th of March is too high. 15th, 16th too high. 17th, 18th too high. 19th too high. 20th too high. 21, 22. By 25th of March, it suddenly becomes a very good function. If we continue it from now, it fits really well. So basically, somewhere over here, well before the peak, there's enough information in that straight line to determine where it's going to go. This simply comes from fitting the straight line early on, and from that getting the function. Now, essentially what we're doing is, for each time along the pandemic, say we knew the data up to here, we're doing a fit up to here and seeing how it fits. This is something where we can do it at every point, and essentially we're fitting a straight line. In fact, there are two different straight lines. One is this straight line and one is this straight line. And these can both be fitted in different ways, but fitting straight lines is difficult because you don't know what segment of the straight line to fit, whether you should weight the fit, do you include the outliers and things like this. Okay, so now, sorry, forgive me. Okay, so originally we had a method to predict that was very powerful, but very complicated. Nobody understood it. It was a preprint that we put into preprint form in June 2020, and it's still there. But it is extremely powerful, and we start to understand better what it's doing. So let me just say a little bit about that. So in this method, here is the total number of cases. Say we're over here, we fit straight lines and make many different predictions because there are many different straight lines that you can fit to a straight line, beginning and endpoints everywhere. And then we take where we have most of these little blue dots. Instead of showing like we saw for New York, it gets bigger, 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 but suddenly gets right. When these blue red squares are at this level, they mean the prediction is correct. So here we see that for China, after about here, we were correct. We see here for Germany, we're correct after here. Here are some other cases. Italy, correct about here. Here a bit too low, but settling down, and so on. So basically, these two methods, this is the method using the Z line, and this the J line, can both predict quite well, but they're very noisy. This just shows some of the predictions in China, in New York City, and in Germany. And again, this suggests that we could predict quite well over here. Then, of course, they released a lot of extra data. This is just showing that in Italy, or Marseille, Italy, all of Italy and the whole of Europe, very similar kinds of fits, showing that in some ways the phenomenon is scale-free. And basically, the United States never really was predicted well because there were multiple outbreaks in the United States. This outbreak seems to be settling down, and then a new outbreak occurs. Okay, so now we're going to jump forward and go to work that was started in December last year for the Omicron outbreak. This outbreak first started in South Africa and was very, very scary. At about the time we were approaching this, I decided to simplify the methods I was using, and instead of using code that was hard to understand, put them into Excel. And this in Excel is just showing this J line going down. You fit a line to it, and from that you predict in red what should be happening. Very fortunately, the same Ben Martin, my colleague on Twitter, converted this to Google Sheets. And then there was an app online that could do the same thing, an app where you could enter the country, the start date, the end date, whether it was cases or deaths, and how many points you were fitting. So there's a lot of parameters you could enter and interactively see what was going on. This just shows an animation of the first outbreak in the United States. And you can see each day we get more and more data, but the J line is going down its line. We didn't know it, and as we do that, the prediction, this red line, gets better and better. Theoretically, when the blue line hits this pink line, we should be at the peak. We are, and after that, the fit just gets better and better. So this is a method that can be applied in real time to these cases. So now I'm just going to show you some real-time forecasting that was done in real time for the United Kingdom in December. And these are actual tweets that were time-stamped on different days. So on the 22nd of December, we were well before the peak. I thought the peak would be on the 24th of December, and it would have a certain size. And then every 2 days, I made another prediction. And this is just showing that in the end, the peak height was 171 on the 2nd of January. These numbers were too low, too high, but basically getting in the right ballpark, The important thing is they said this was going to end. Now, initially we said it would end on the 24th of December. It actually ended about a week later. But given that when we said it, it was very early, we were basically at a point where we had, the peak was hardly starting. So this is again encouraging. Okay, let me now move to the last part of my talk, East Asia today. So I went to this app this morning and put into the app Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and all of China. And we see here that Japan is well past the peak. You can see it's past the peak in new cases. And this blue line actually indicated quite well. If this blue line points to here, it's doing quite well. It looks like the slope was steeper and is getting less steep. We don't really know exactly what's happening. But basically in Japan, there were 5.5 million cases and 100,000 deaths. And that means there was one death for every 540 cases. That's the case fatality ratio. The other thing is that the peak for deaths, so this is a mistake, this should be 2nd February. The peak for deaths was on the 12th of February, 2/12, and the peak for death was about 10 days later. Another typo, lots of typos here, okay. In South Korea, we see the same thing, but the South Korean outbreak is still, it may have peaked, it's not finished yet. We see that the cases maybe have peaked. This line has crossed this line. The deaths are perhaps peaking, but here they have the deaths peaking. Here the cases peaked just a week ago on the 22nd of March. Again, a typo. Oh boy. No, sorry. My British dates and my American dates drive me crazy. That should have been the 22nd of March. And but these haven't peaked yet. We're not sure exactly what's going on. It turns out that when you come to fit a straight line like this, you can fit 21 days of the line or 7 days of the line or something different. Here's just an example of doing the same thing, just fitting the last part of the line, and it changes the date on which the peak occurs. But my guess is we don't really know whether it's this one or this one. Changing this, changes the outcome in terms of the number of cases from 35,000 deaths to 17,000 deaths. So again, there can be big differences. If we go to Singapore, we find that the Singapore is well past the peak. You can see here, it's a long way past the peak. The peak was quite hard to predict because there were these extra bumps. So these lines, this straight line could have been perhaps fitted by that, but very difficultly. The deaths again were not easy to predict. A very interesting thing in Singapore is that the total number of cases is about 800,000, 872,000. The total number of deaths is only 410. So there are only one death for every 2,000 cases. That is very, very low. Hong Kong. So Hong Kong and Singapore have always been places that I compare. They're similar sizes, both ex-British colonies, both islands. But when it came to Corona, they behaved rather differently. So Hong Kong again follows this Gompertz line. There's a change of slope over here. Maybe a second outbreak, it's not clear, but they are really done with their peak. And in this whole period, they would have had about 1.1 million cases. But the number of deaths is 9,000. So they have one death for every 120 cases, whereas in Singapore, there was one death for every 2,000 cases. So basically, this is very strange. It's unclear. It may be due to vaccine status. It may be due to how a case is defined, because not everyone defines the case the same way. And finally, and perhaps most interesting, is mainland China. Mainland China has many different outbreaks. I'm just adding them all up together. And we see that for the last 2 weeks, there's been a Gompertz straight line descending with the kind of slope. I didn't point this out, but the slope is usually about 10 days. I'll go back, say, to Korea, the slope is 22 days. In Singapore, the slope was 16 days. In Britain, the slope, I think, was 12 days. This slope is about what you'd expect. When it comes to deaths, the slope is 12 days, but the number of deaths in Hong Kong was predicted to be very large. Up till now, I think there are, I don't know how many deaths there are, maybe 6,000 deaths altogether, but the predicted value at the end will be 9,000. And then finally, mainland China, 2 deaths, but not fitted by anything. Cases have definitely seemed to be at a peak, but of course you can never rule out another big outbreak over here. And it's very difficult to know what to make of this, because big cities like Shenzhen and Shanghai are locked down. The lockdown certainly seems to be stopping this, but the death toll seems to be, at least as reported, extremely small. We haven't heard anything about hospitals being overloaded. And it seems that, again, there's a fight to keep this number as small as possible. This is just a table comparing all those different values. The dates are again wrong for Korea, but basically you get a very wide range of number of deaths per case. Japan and Korea are in the 500 or 600s. For other countries, most countries for Omicron have been between 300 and 600 or something like that. Singapore is incredibly low. This could be because they are counting cases in a different way. It could be because they're counting deaths as deaths only from COVID. In China, the numbers are again very hard to assess. They are getting cases, but they don't seem to be having any death. So just to end, this has been a tough time because there's been a huge amount of effort to suppress alternative views. And I think everything I've said has been based on science. I myself am very well vaccinated. I've been vaccinated fully in 2 different countries, and think the vaccine is a good thing. I didn't have any side effects. But it's quite clear now that if we look at the excess data, the burden of death from COVID has been less than 3 months of extra death over 2 years. And that is, significant, but it's probably less than bad flus, say the 1957 flu. It's twice to 3 times as bad as the 2017-18 flu. But for those flus, we didn't stop the world. We didn't stop children going to school. We didn't lock down. So there's been a very different treatment. And, in 1957, we didn't have a flu vaccine. The flu vaccine also is not more than maybe 50% effective. So there's been a lot of antagonism to try to have everyone believe that this has been a super terrible, colossal problem. And the data doesn't solve that. So I'm often reminded of my hero and mentor, Max Borut, the person who invented protein crystallography. He said, and this, I believe, is the name of an institute or an auditorium in Austria, in science, truth always wins. And that is very, very important, because science is based on numbers. And it's not just based on numbers, but if I say, for example, that the epidemic is spreading by gompertz in each outbreak, and somebody else says it's exponential, there are going to be future respiratory outbreaks. And my bet is that they're going to spread by gompertz, not by exponential, but with the structure of society will remain as it is. There will be people with many connections and many people with few connections. And for this reason, we get this gompertz spread. So, it's good for me to think about that. I just wanted to end by acknowledging my major collaborator, Francesco Zonta, who's at Shanghai Tech in Shanghai. 2 other collaborators who were at Stanford, they both left since then, Andreas Skajewicz and John Rodriguez, and the NIH for their support. Thank you all for your attention.